Order. The first item is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. No one has approached either of us relative to public comments, so we'll move on to the approval of the April 12th minutes. What are your wishes? They were in the packet. Moved by Supervisor Leahy, seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. And without objection, we're going to take a couple of things out of order. We'll take first the discussion and possible action on the resolution extending encumbrances for the ARPA funds for the Regional Forensic Science Center project and amending the 2023 KIP budget and authorizing expenditures for design services. First, and then Supervisor McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, myself and Jess Blahnik, who is our medical examiner, are here to ask the HR Finance and Property Committee to support the resolution which is in your packet, starting on page 79 and 80 and 81, if you had a chance to review it. This resolution is very critical for the success of the Marathon County Regional Morgue Science Center, not morgue, forensic, we took morgue out of there, Forensic Science Center, and the Morgue Task Force did approve this resolution last Friday, and yesterday the Public Safety Committee also approved it. The resolution has three parts that are all very time sensitive and need to be approved by Public Safety, HR Finance and Property, and ultimately the full board. The resolution has three parts, and like I said, the first part is asking to extend the date to utilize ARPA funds that was approved by the county board from July 31st, 2023 to December 31st, 2023. The reason right now, there's tentative funding from the state, which we may not have an answer before July 31st. We need to know that because this is all contingent with getting the resources to fund this project. The second part, or Jessica actually received an email last week from Senator Baldwin's office that there has been congressionally directed spending for this project for $2 million, but we may not have updates till sometime in the summer. This is why we need to extend the date to December 31st, 2023, because we may not have answers from the state or the federal funding programs. The second request is to amend the 2023 capital improvement project budget, as this project is not yet does not yet exist in Marathon County, so we need to add it to the 2023 KIP budget. And the third request of this resolution is to authorize $178,095 of the $2 million of ARPA funds to utilize to procure a design phase for the Forensic Science Center. And they estimate that this design phase could take 5 to 6 months. And if the funding does come through, and we would already have the design done possibly or started, we could start the bidding process for this in December or January of 2024, which is very important. The longer that you go into the year, the RFPs usually tend to get larger, so we don't want to prolong this and have any increased costs. I don't know if Jess has anything to add.
The other issue is if we do not get started with the design process sometime in June or early July, is that if the RFP gets pushed further, it might have to be pushed to 2025, which would increase construction costs by inflation of roughly 5%. So on a $14.8 million project, that's a lot of money. The other issue is there's potentially a few forensic pathologists that would be available and have expressed interest in the past to relocate to Marathon County. If we're pushed out a year or 2 years from where we are now, there's a chance that those forensic pathologists would find other employment.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee?
I just have a quick question from Mike. On the be it further resolved, the final one, the county board authorizes the amendment of the 2023 budget to reflect the encumbrances and expenditures. Should that include the 2023 capital improvement plan? We reference that up in the last whereas, but we don't reference it in the be it resolves.
The second, be it further resolved, does amend
Oh,
the
I'm sorry, I missed,
2023.
yes,
Yep.
yeah, I apologize, you're right. It's right in front of me. So are there any questions? Cody?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My one question here, and it kind of relates to where everything's moving. I know we're trying to consolidate buildings. This move, would that mean that the medical examiner's office would be moved to this regional forensic center as well then? And that would mean that we're vacating the West Street site, right, then?
Correct,
Okay.
yes. Our office and all operations would be moving into this facility, so this would be our new home, because in the West Street Master Plan, we're virtually homeless.
That's what I wanted to keep an eye on too. So I think that's good then that we're helping vacate that property for redevelopment in the future and putting the medical examiner's office in a very appropriate home. So thanks.
Supervisor Lemmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have like 5 questions, sorry. And I'll try and be efficient with them. So my first set really I'd like you to go backwards a little. This plan, I know, has been talked about for several years, maybe 5.
2017.
So since 2017, there's been COVID. Fond du Lac, I think, has opened and closed. Brown County has opened. Can you just talk about the impact and how relevant this study updated since then?
So we have not called the counties back and did that extensive work, but what can I tell you? Milwaukee County has lost a forensic pathologist, so they're very short-staffed right now. They have stopped providing forensic pathology services to a few counties, so then those counties now are relying on UW and Fond du Lac for autopsy services. The Fond du Lac County Medical Examiner is very overwhelmed and physically cannot keep up with his caseload. He is very supportive of the project and also wants to be one of our partner offices where we can help support each other. UW-Madison is also in the same boat. They have taken on additional counties. For the most part, they're very good to work with. We're their largest client. We're one of their favorite clients that we're good to work with as an office, so we don't have many issues. However, we do have delays in getting those autopsies scheduled. Dane County is short a pathologist. They are very overwhelmed. They have an extensive backlog. Brown County does have a forensic pathologist. They currently are only serving Brown, Door, and Oconto County, which is their 3-county partnership. I'm not sure if they're serving any other counties. It might just be like one additional county, but no others. Waukesha County also has a forensic pathologist, and they only do autopsies for Waukesha County. So it is a very needed resource.
So when I've just looked and tried to find new information, I'm seeing a lot of difficulty finding pathologists. If I'm remembering correctly, that's why Fond du Lac wound up closing down. They're reopened, so are they fully staffed? And I know you said we have prospective 2 pathologists that want to come and could come, but will they come? And why haven't we gone back to Fond du Lac, or are we sending some of our autopsies to Fond du Lac?
We rarely use Fond du Lac. UW has always been our primary provider since way before my time. They do very good service where we kind of get priority for cases. If they have a lot of cases in a lot of counties, they usually call us back first. So we don't typically have too much issue getting in. Fond du Lac is typically booked out a week at a time, so UW can get us in quicker. And I don't want to add more to Dr. Kolbach's plate. So we do get along great. We do utilize him from time to time. He is fully open. I don't know where it's said anywhere that was closed for a while because they were open and operational. There was a time in between when Dr. Kelly resigned. They did hire one. There was some issues with that pathologist where he has since resigned, but he did have some issues with licensure that held up, but they were fully open besides that little short stint since Dr. Kolbach has been in for the last few years. As far as recruitment, the nice thing with Marathon County is the pathologist who wants to work in Marathon County is going to be far different from the pathologist that wants to work in Detroit, Madison, Chicago, the bigger cities. We have a very unique partnership here with the Medical College of Wisconsin and North Central Technical College that would put us as one of the few teaching institutions for a medical examiner educational partnership, which if a lot of forensic pathologists love pathology because they love the teaching aspect of that. So that would be a huge draw.
Okay, so just switching gears a little bit, I trying to look at the business plan, which I'm, retired teacher, so keep that with a grain of salt. And so please be patient with me. But it's page 135 in the packet, but 18 on the business plan. I'm just not really sure. When I look at the projections, it looks like, I don't know why, actually, depreciation and interest is not being included. If that's included, I'd just like to know how does that impact, because it doesn't look like we're going to make a lot of money, and maybe this isn't meant to be an enterprise fund or business like some of the other things that we have, but I wonder what that impact will be. And then when I go down to page 135 and it talks about the sensitivity analysis, if I'm reading it correctly, we're not going to make any money. In fact, we're going to lose money. And does the money that we lose, it looks like it's going to be more than what we're currently losing by sending the autopsies down to Madison.
So the sensitivity was an analysis to show if we do not have a forensic pathologist that we do still have some revenue streams coming in where it's not an entire loss. And I believe part of that, they had the cost of that was before the loss and depreciation, I believe. So that was if we had to bond it out. So if we didn't have a forensic pathologist, we wouldn't have between $200,000 and $300,000 per doctor salary and benefits. And also, we wouldn't need a deaner as well. We would just have a very nice facility for our operations, which that would reduce costs. However, we still could get revenue through doing the tissue recovery at our facility. That's a per case typically reservation for that space, which is greatly needed. So there is revenue sources if we didn't have that. So I don't think that portion got updated after we had planned to have hoping that the facility would be fully funded.
Okay, so as long as that's out there, I can, one more just little thing, when I looked at the land that's being purchased, it looks like, or at least that's being offered by NTC, it's $300,000, but it's somewhere in this plan, it says there's other county-owned land. Can you just talk about the options that we have with county-owned land and then the NTC's choice?
I will refer that to Lance.
Great. I'll go through a couple other things as well, but I'll start with the land piece. So as was alluded to, one of the nice things about this project taking an exceedingly long time, as Task Force Chair McEwen has frequently alludes to, the longest standing task force, I think, in probably our history. It's gone through many iterations. I mean, that potential location has moved a number of times. The business model has changed. So to your earlier point about has the plan been updated? My answer would be yes, absolutely. The point that Jess is making is we haven't called all of the counties again to confirm that they're still interested in partnering, because we know that the environment of forensic autopsy for local governments hasn't fundamentally changed. You highlighted a couple, but we've updated the financials a number of times with some partnership pieces, with the increased cost for forensic pathology, some additional revenue opportunities. So the numbers have been updated, but no, we didn't call Price County to see if they're still interested in coming to us, because Price County is still interested in cutting down the drive time from, we're before you hit Madison, Fond du Lac, Green Bay, we're closer. So that part hasn't changed. But as it relates to land, that has been talked about a number of times. So we talked about having county-owned land. We talked about partnering with the various healthcare systems, because that's another component of this project where I think we still have opportunities to kind of build upon as the project moves forward. But ultimately, we really came to this point where we are today, which is a really great opportunity for not only Marathon County, central Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin, but even regionally within the country, is this teaching collaborative that Jess alluded to with the Medical College of Wisconsin, North Central Technical College, our local universities, creating an environment where we create a teaching opportunity that doesn't exist elsewhere. So when you look to the designs, you'll see a teaching observation deck and other things. Those don't exist. We'd be creating something that really quite unique. So that is primarily the driver on the current location we're looking at. But we're not, we're kind of location agnostic. It's partnership driven. But we do have a potential location identified. I wouldn't get too hung up on location, because as it drives cost, North Central Technical College has rules relative to their ability to transfer property to us for, it's got to be for fair market value. But they're willing to work with us to say, hey, we will find some in-kind contributions that we can offset that cost. So it doesn't fundamentally change the math relative to the capital contributions needed to build the facility. To your earliest point, I wanted to go back. The financials are such, it's important to look at this from an environment where this is a mandated service. We'll get to that later in your big document. We are mandated to deliver a lot of this. The teaching stuff is new, not mandated to do that. Great opportunity, but not mandated. We're mandated to deliver this service. Jess's department currently is significantly levy funded. It has some revenues already, but significantly levy funded. This analysis assumes that levy contribution continues. We are, I would characterize our projections as, well, they're conservative from a cautious standpoint. We are being relatively reserved in how many people are going to utilize us. I think we're going to be doing very well because, as Jess said, we have a strong reputation not only with our current autopsy providers, but with counties around us. We're viewed as, we are the largest show in town. People turn to Jess and her team. We have some other things too that we're trying to identify potential revenue streams that we could do. So that's a positive. We think people are going to turn to us. And even with those cautious numbers, we are essentially cash flow neutral. We're not going to make a bunch of money. We're not going to lose money. We think we're going to do well, but it does not service debt. That has been known from day one of this task force. That has been a constant. It's not going to service debt. That said, with all the capital contributions that we've alluded to before, with Task Force Chair McEwen referencing the federal applications we've made, the state applications we've made. We just met earlier today, this afternoon, talking about what are some other opportunities that we might pursue, because some of the state funding requirements have a 50% local match, but that can be made up of course, green dollars, real dollars in capital, but also the capital contributions in kind. So we're talking about all those things. But yes, to your point, is it different than the landfill? Absolutely. The landfill is fully enterprise, The expectation is that it's fully funded from operational revenues. In fact, we're going to increase that this coming budget. We're going to have them pay in. That's the goal. This is different. I mean, nobody gets into the autopsy business because it's a good business. It's not quite as bad a business as running a jail, but it's not a good business. So I hope that answers a lot of your questions.
If I may add one thing, and I'm glad you brought that up. When the task force was first put together, we were talking about closing the pool and a new pool is going in. Our first thought was, we got a building, we're going to move this forensic science center into where the old swimming pool was. Well, that didn't pan out. We then were working with medical facilities. We looked at renting or a condo or buying a condo from Wausau Hospital in the old Liberty building, and that didn't pan out. The old bank, Marshfield Clinic had the BMO Bank, I think, on the corner there. That didn't work out. We looked at tearing down the cold storage where the medical examiner's office is now. That didn't pan out because of the master plan. So we've had opportunities, and in fact I asked the administrator to look at any other properties that Marathon County owned that would be that would be suitable for this. But location is very important. You have people coming from Bryce County, Vilas County. They can't miss the tech. I mean, and this is what's and the same with the hospital when we were talking about going into there. So, we're being somewhat selective, but I think this opportunity, as the administrator said, to partner with the tech and all the teachings along with the criminal justice. The time there, I talked to the sheriff yesterday. He said every sheriff and police department north of here is just hoping we get that because, like the administrator said, they don't want to drive down to Milwaukee or down to Madison to do these. So, I mean, it's a needed for Marathon County, but also will be very beneficial, for the northern region. That's why it's called the Regional Forensic Science Center. So, but thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, a motion would be in order. Supervisor Leahy,
I would move to approve and move on to the full board.
is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the resolution and advancing it to the county board will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Next, without objection, we will take up the discussion of the tax delinquent property at 3051 North 6th Street, Wausau. And I ask that be put on the agenda after receiving a call from neighbors to the property who were concerned because it's been tax delinquent since 2012, and they've had some issues with the failure to keep the property up and other things. So, Mike, you talked briefly about whether, and I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to look at how we might use the NREM process that we just approved and whether or not there are some opportunities to streamline this. But we're at that point where we're beginning to lose money on these properties because it's been tax delinquent for 10 plus years. They're written off after the 10th year, so we lose any potential recapture taxes that we buy the tax rolls every year, so we need to move on many of these old properties, and I think the neighbors are looking at what sort of timeline. So in light of the recent action, I know we're really throwing it at you. Are there some opportunities for us to accelerate the taking of some of these properties and then ultimately get to the point where we can put them out for sale? And Connie, Mike, whoever.
I can start, and Connie, you can fill in if I'm missing anything. Yeah, I think the first big step that was taken was the board's approval of the NREM process. right now, Connie, Steve, and we've met. We're working on getting our policies and procedures updated so that we can start providing the notices that are required under the statute to utilize that process. In terms of accelerating this particular property or any particular property, I think I wouldn't use the word accelerating because there are still some specific statutory timelines related to the notice, but I think where in rem is going to help in particular to this property is we can include it along with the multiple other properties that we're doing in a first wave instead of doing property by property. That's the real big advantage of in rem is having that list that you provide to the clerk of courts and bring through the court process. So I certainly think that will help when we've reached that point where the notice is sufficient and we're ready to file the court case, we're able to file on multiple properties. I think that just in and of itself is going to streamline the process. But that's just my 2 cents. Connie, feel free to weigh in.
Okay, the property is actually delinquent since 2014. They owe $15,177.93 on the property. $498 of that is special charges put on the property that are delinquent utilities, some miscellaneous and noxious weeds. The city of Wausau put those on. Currently, this property is on the list that was just submitted to Runkle Abstract last week, and they are number 83 on that list. So they are being researched right now. Once Runkle is completed with that, he will submit it to us. And within the next couple weeks, my office is working with corporate counsel, and we're going to be getting ready for that letter that needs to go out to these properties. And statutorily, they have notice of 90 days. So we're looking for owners of that property. And I was contacted a month ago regarding that property from a restoration company, and I informed him that right now we have to do research and we haven't done anything on there. I referred him to talk to a title company so that he could find any potential owners of the property and do a private sale. And he is aware of what the taxes were, and that didn't bother him, but he is looking to purchase the property and flip it. So that was his intent. But at this time, I did talk to him, and he only called me one time. So I haven't heard from him since. So that's kind of where we are at with that property right now.
So as we look at these properties, and I know Supervisor Hart has one as well. So if we've got a 90-day window, so can we be moving on these this calendar year and get them off so we're not buying? I don't know when we reconcile the tax bills, but it would be nice if we didn't buy another year of taxes.
The intent is to not extend this over this year. We want to get this property moving this year. So we have the wave of the 50 properties, the first 50, and then we're moving on this. So as soon as we get notification from the research, letters will be sent. And then we'll be working with Corp Counsel in the court system to put these lists to NREM.
So I know you're working at an expedited letter. Do you want to just share what you're,
Well, we're,
not an expedited, but a revised letter?
yes, to be simplified. So we want to make sure all the legal information is in this letter. Once we have this letter, then we will be submitting that to the owners, the lien holders, judgments, and any current owners we find on the property. And then we have to wait the 90 days. So
From the date that they received the letter?
Correct. Because that's statute.
Chair Gibbs, and then,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the question then becomes, once the 90 days has expired, how long is the remaining process? And maybe this is a question for Corp Counsel also, to schedule that for a court hearing date and actually start to take those properties so that we can effectively start to move those off and put them back onto the property tax rolls.
Sure. So I'll first preface this by saying I haven't done any in-rem foreclosures in my career. So, but I have reached out to colleagues. Many counties around the state already have this process down. So I have templates for all the forms that we need to file with the court. Going to Chair Robinson's question as well, is this a process that can be accomplished this year? I think absolutely it is. The court filing itself is not overly onerous, and once that filing is done, there are certain notice requirements in the court case, but those are, I believe, 30 or 60 days related to when the before the court can enter judgment. So you're looking at a 90-day period plus the additional 30 to 60 days relative to the court process. And that's for the entirety of the process, and then you get a clean order at the end foreclosing on the property and providing title to the county. So it is a process that I think can be worked through.
Supervisor Hart and then Chair Gibbs.
And kind of with that in mind, because I know with the particular constituent that I had, she had been given the advice also to seek to do a private sale as well. And I know just right now there's the potential that that could be faster. And that's kind of why that advice was given. Because even in communicating with my constituent, it was like I was trying to explain the process, and I kind of said, well, when the government takes property, it has to go through due process. So we there's a lot of things that it has to go through. So the in-rem process helps us move it along faster than probably before, but I just wanted clarification of private has the potential for also getting this through faster, but with the particular situation my constituent is going through, it seems like the previous owner has passed away, so it's very difficult to contact someone who's dead. So that's kind of what's going on, and that's why I had that question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I think private sale could be done tomorrow if the current owner and the prospective new owner can come to an agreement. It's just like, as you said, can the former owner or the current owner be located? Will they strike an agreement with the private party? That's something that the county doesn't really have any interaction with at all. The new buyer would then have to take on the outstanding taxes as a part of taking the property as well. So, but yeah, in theory, it could be done tomorrow.
Chair Gibbs.
The only other question I would have is, does the process or get bogged down by any owner-occupied properties in eviction notices, requirements, anything on that line during that same period that we're talking, 90-day notification, and then the court 60-day, 30, 60-day, whatever?
The owner occupancy or non-occupancy shouldn't have any bearing on those notice periods. In most cases, the owner is going to stay in the property if they're already in there during that time. Once the county has acquired the property, that's when we start taking the eviction action and making sure that we have a property that doesn't have someone on it who's not allowed to be there, but it should not impact that timeline.
You don't mind me chiming in here. There might be one thing that might hold it up a little bit is the health department environmental study. I talked to the health department this morning, and of the first list of 50 we gave them, they completed 20, and that was within a year, and they are down an inspector and currently hiring for one. So they are very backed up and delayed, and said you would expect to see even slower results, possibly. So they got 20 of them done in a year. And I know that's part of the county's ordinance passed by this committee that environmental screen is needed. So that's something, an action that this committee can look into. Is it necessary to have?
Well, and, I'm just going to comment on that what the health department does doesn't meet any legal standards. quite honestly, there's an all-appropriate inquiry standard that is based upon an ASTM guideline, is what is an appropriate Phase 1 environmental assessment. We are not doing that. It is at best an old transaction screen, looking at databases to see if there is anything there and doing a physical inspection, but it wouldn't pass muster. The critical thing for the county is that we are eligible for a statutory liability exemption under Chapter 75 through the acquiring of the property through a qualified means, which includes tax deed or NREM foreclosure. So the question, and it may be a good issue for us to revisit in the future, I don't think that the health department's standard would meet the EPA definition of all appropriate inquiry. So why are we doing it are we doing it to make us feel good because it doesn't carry with it any necessary protection that is not already granted under existing law. So if we're not getting the value in it, why do we do it and add to our process? And I think that there are ways of searching databases pretty easily that we could do that administratively, and I would be happy to work with people in setting up that process to do so, but it might be worthwhile for us to look at trying to accelerate it if we do have that backlog. Mike?
Thank you, Chair Robinson. And we talked a little bit about this in previous meetings, and I think you kind of stole my thunder, so I'm not going to go over what you just said. But this committee did direct staff to start looking at the ordinance that applies once we've acquired the tax deed property to the actual disposition of it, where that environmental screen lives. So we are working on bringing some recommendations to you about what that ordinance could look like in the future, how that could assist in this process. I think that will be very beneficial. Another piece to keep in mind as a part of any transaction, when the county has the land and is selling the land, we make sure that the land is being sold with a clear sold as is disclaimer so that we're not taking on any additional liabilities. So those are all important things to note.
Minister Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve, one of the kind of underlying questions that Chair Robinson asked was, this idea that after 10 years we're writing off our lost ability to collect on those past due taxes. Can you talk about, you referenced this kind of first wave and a second proverbial wave, how, based on how those waves are looking and how far you're getting down your priority list, does it address that concern that we're going to be still dealing with properties that, hey, we could be writing off lost past due taxes?
Yeah, so, with that said, the first wave will get us, the first wave of 50 parcels will get us through those tax write-off years. So the ones that made our criteria will be, if we get them 50 done, will be about 2 years ahead of the write-off process. But there is parcels that will always stay on that list due to our selection criteria as well. And we have 8 properties that we know of that this committee already did not approve of in the past because of contamination issues and things. So those will always be written off unless re-looked at. And then we have 78 properties that during our selection had a tax balance of $1,000 or less, which is roughly an assessment value of $6,000 or under. And a lot of them are sliver parcels or unknown landowners that were researched and put on the tax base due to description errors. And I know once we do address those parcels, it'll take this committee and Corp Council, I'm sure, to find a way on how to handle the sale of them, because a lot of that you might be selling a strip of land that's 5 feet blocking a person's driveway, and it might only benefit one person. So there's 78 of those, and that's through all different years. I'm not sure how many are on the tax write-off part of that 78, but I do know for sure that there's definitely 8 properties that this committee did say no on that would always be written off unless action is taken. We have one under Rule 3, which the parcel must not have tax delinquent years to be written off. Okay, so under my wave of parcels that I put to Runkle, one parcel was, they only had a tax delinquent year that was to be written off already, so we couldn't collect. So that one will be gone once it's written off this year. I'm working with the audit and season right now on getting that one removed. And then we also have 11 properties that are not at that write-off stage, but are under a payment agreement. So they're working on paying their taxes, which the county is actually collecting interest and penalties on that and keeping current with their current taxes. So as long as they stay on that agreement, they will never make it to the committee or hopefully not county-owned. But just to go back to your the first wave of 50 properties will get us past those tax write-off years for the majority of them. And then the next wave of, we have about 177 parcels, will get us up to the 2018 tax year. And then we would have another wave that becomes eligible in September to take. And right now, I'm hoping that list will shrink. It has, that 2019 tax year was, is quite large. It's sitting at 116 eligible parcels right now, but people are paying them as we published in the paper about a month or so ago. And I know with that publication, people look at it and read, and they are paying them down. So I know Connie and I are both hoping that once we get these letters, some of them, they get our notices all the time. Like we send notices 2 times a year that they're delinquent and they don't make the payments. But once they get an official letter that you got 90 days to pay up or you're going to lose the property, and then their mortgage companies get that notification as well, and any lien holders, they're going to look into that and say, well, gosh, I have this 1 year that's delinquent and I have all the other stuff that's paid. We're going to just pay this and not have to deal with it. So we're hoping they get a little push with those letters, and we'll see a lot more paid that we don't need to take to court, hopefully.
And I think building on that point, there's also the optics of it's a different letter when it's a letter that's a court notice as opposed to a letter from the treasurer's office. So I think we're cautiously optimistic that too will see an improvement, but I wanted to at least give Steve and Connie the opportunity to convey to Chair Robinson's kind of underlying point. Well, is our process in terms of prioritization addressing what we as staff inferred as one of your driving goals, which was limit the write-offs that we would have? And as Steve laid out, yes, our process through those kind of the waves that are coming, we should get through those write-off years. We'll make significant process, hopefully through the in-rem process this year, with concluding that first wave, hopefully getting a good portion through that second wave. Those other properties that Steve referenced, kind of the remnant parcels from whether it's a survey, correction of surveys, those are going to take, I think on the staff side, and please correct me if I'm wrong or if I misstate this, Mike and Steve and Connie, it's going to be a bit more nuanced because, as Steve said, essentially you might have a strip between these two pieces of property that the last transaction document we have is from an original land grant from 1875, and it's a 5-foot strip between two parcels. The statutes have certain prohibitions on our ability to directly sell to individual landowners, but in this case, we're going to look at, can you sell to an adjoining landowner? And there are certain instances when that's permitted, as I understand it, based on my limited looking into that right now. But we're not prioritizing those. The priority are the properties that you're talking about where there's a dwelling, improvements on the property, delinquent taxes, that let's get these back on the tax roll to have significant benefit to the county based on the prioritization criteria that Steve referenced before. So if you have any questions about that, happy to add additional information. And I see Connie, you want to add anything?
I just wanted you to know too that in the last couple weeks since the INREM came to the board, we've had a lot of property owners come to us with payoffs. So they're like in the $60,000 range. So I'm waiting on another one that's going to be another $70,000. So they are coming to find ways of paying their taxes because they know that we're coming after them and they could lose their house and they don't want to lose their house. So I think that the process will work, and us adjusting this letter to state that they're going to be going to court is more effective, because just last year I sent out certificate letters and it doesn't seem to do anything, but it seems to be more effective if a bank sends them a notice that they're not paying their taxes because they have mortgages. So I've also been in contact with several banks to say, are you watching the mortgages? Are you paying attention that they're not paying their taxes? So I'm getting more and more calls between me and Steve and Erica from banks stating we need to know what the payoff is, and they're finding ways to get these things paid. So it is working, and I think honestly having a more of a threatening kind of a letter that's coming from a lawyer, court, instead of just the treasurer is more effective. So I do believe that the system will work. So.
And to add to that, how fast people are scared and are paying, I was creating this list last week, and of that like 177 next wave to Runkle, I mean, we already had 5 drop. So I mean, they're paying. So I mean, they're going to be dropping off the list as they're paying. People could be paying them right now with the mail, just mailing us a check. So I'm hoping that, you know, the more they hear of this, the more they're going to pay off. And really, I think once we give them that initial reaction letter, I think that's really going to drive a lot. So
We look forward to continued success.
Yep,
And thank
we
you
just
for
want to
those-
say thank you for also allowing us to do this additional process within REM. I really think it's going to be effective, so thank you.
All right. We don't, it's more for information. We put it there just in case there was something we needed to do, but I think you're on top of that process, and we look forward to continue updates. Maybe we'll schedule it for an update in the near future. But I think we need to revisit that whole issue of the transaction screen. If we're having difficulty getting that and it doesn't bring the value, why are we doing it? If it's another step that isn't necessary. All right, now we'll go back to discussion regarding the 2024 annual budget and policy recommendations from the committee. And I guess that I key that off, and Lance corrects me when I misspeak and that. So we've been meeting with all of the committees to go over the new process that this committee put together relative to the budget process. And there are multiple opportunities for individual committees to weigh in and for the board to weigh in. And that process was modified based upon comments we received last year during the budget process. And thank you to Supervisor Hart for his efforts and some of these changes and others. But during the month of May forward, really looking for input from the standing committees on budgets for departments within their committee's jurisdictions relative to a number of questions. What programs should we be delivering? At what level should those services be delivered? You know, to a degree, who's our target population in the delivery of those services? And what sort of rates and fees should we be charging associated with those? And the administrator has done a very good job of helping prepare us for those discussions, in that he's prepared a number of documents and shared those with them, and they're part of the packet. But one is the mandated versus non-mandated services, and there are a wide variety of services that are mandated, but the clerk's office is not mandated to support the county board and track our budget and other things. But I think we would have a hard time if they did, if she didn't. And she would be oh so happy.
You are mandated for meetings.
In Administrator Leonard, we'll talk about the highway department later, but look at the sheriff's department. We are required to have a sheriff's department. We are not required to have a bomb squad. We are not required to have a crisis assessment response team or people dedicated to that. We do that because they make sense. They increase the safety of our citizens. And many of those non-mandated services are popular with Republicans save the county money elsewhere. So that's there for reference. There is also a schedule of fees for the various departments. Some of those are set by statutes. Some of those are some fees we collect in the Register of Deeds office, and others are statutorily based, and so that money flows to the state of Wisconsin with a portion of it kept here. There are opportunities for us to look at those fees. And there is then the 5-year average spending and levy for each of the departments. And within our jurisdiction, we have the Corporation Council, a budget of $966,000, $459,000 of that's on the levy, 47%. The clerk's office has a budget of $602,000, $461,000 on the levy, 77%. The treasurer has a budget of $480,000, but they take in almost $20 million because all the property tax, the number of things, the second payment of the property taxes flows through them, and so they're at a minus 4,161%. I don't think that's really reflective of the revenue they're bringing in through fees, but rather their statutory responsibility to be that collector. Employee resources, $724,500, basically $560,000 on the levy, 77%. Facilities, just $6 million of expenditures, $4,959,000 of levy, 83%. That's where we get into fuel costs. Register deeds, basically $600,000 budget. They take in an excess $459,000 again through some of those fees. So they're at a negative 77%. Again, some of those are prescribed by the state. Finance department, $892,000 budget, $619,000 levy, 69%. Then we have capital improvements at $606,852,000, a levy of $77,000. And then we have the contingency, which sort of falls within this. I think the reason we're raising those is that not all dollars are the same. There are within social services is at about a 34% levy. A lot of their funding comes through grants and other things. So when we start talking about across the board budgets, it has the potential ripple effect of impacting other programs. And we need to keep that in mind as we go through and look at it. We're asking each of the committees to look at what sort of guidance do we want to provide administration. And in light of the recent discussion that we had relative to the creation of an energy task force, which was driven by the increase of utility costs of in excess of $400,000 last year, one of the things we may want to consider as a committee is, do we want to have a 5 or 10% reduction in therms or kilowatt hours to power our facilities as a goal, and what sort of capital expenditure or modifications might be required in the budget in order to have some long-term savings. Those are some things that we might want to have discussions on as we go forward. There are other opportunities. So if you have programs that you need explanation on, or not only what are we doing currently, but what should we be doing going forward, I think that's what we're hoping to generate. So we'll be looking at that part of the budget. Later in the agenda today, we are charged as a committee with providing the county board later this month with budget priorities. We'll have a separate discussion on that. And then later this summer, we will have a discussion on budget assumptions. We'll, what do we anticipate sales tax to be? Where are we going with some of those other items? And we'll be forwarding that to the county board so that when the administration is starting to work with the budget, they have a good understanding of where our priorities are, what programs we would like to see evaluated, what programs we might want to see expanded, and what are the opportunities out there, and then what are the assumptions that we're using in developing that budget. So with that, I'll turn it over to the administrator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Chair Robinson referenced, we've been having these conversations with committees. This is kind of the traveling road show to this point. I think we're up to, this is number 6. And I wanted to build off what Chair Robinson said, which I think one of the first big takeaways, those 3 questions that Chair Robinson referenced are really solid policy questions where the board has the opportunity early in this process and really throughout the process to affect the building of the budget. And those 3 questions, again, are what programs or services do you, as the policymakers, want the county to deliver? And of course, as we often say, that is within the realm permitted to you by the state of Wisconsin to make those decisions. Counties are an arm of the state, and they use us like you and I use our arms to affect our will. They tell you what they want you to do. But that leads perfectly into the second policy question, and that is, as Chair Robinson referenced, at what level do you want to deliver those services? The state very frequently provides direction that the counties need to do a certain thing. You need to provide service X. It's far less frequent that the state says, and you need to do it at this level, and this is the performance measure. They leave a lot of that to the counties, as Chair Robinson referenced before. You have the ability to dictate service level. So one of the takeaways under that service level discussion is, well, how do you figure that out? Well, I would say it depends. Classic lawyer answer, it depends. Here are a couple of examples in our discussions with other committees. One really good way I think, for you to look at service is turnaround time. If you think about permits, within our highway department or conservation planning and zoning, if a customer, a landowner comes and wants to have a permit, some sort of zoning change or get through a zoning amendment process, conditional use, what have you, they want to do that yesterday, generally. But how long does it take them to do that? Your service level determinations, how much you staff a department, does have some bearing on that, right? We see that in the workforce today. Everyone is short of people. Think about a restaurant. If you don't have enough staff, the time to get the food out, your ability to get the food out goes down. So we're no different. So time is a good kind of proxy measure for service level. Another good one is quality. And the example I've used at previous committees is you think about our highway department, as Chair Robinson referenced. We have the largest amount of lane miles in the state of Wisconsin. In terms of county highway lane miles, it's 1,235, 0.3, I think, or point something. Anyway, PACER rating is a pavement rating. The county board has said we want an average pavement rating across our vast system of county roadways of 7. It costs a certain level, a certain amount to have that pavement rating of 7. Our general math is what that leads to is you need to have a replacement of, you need to replace roadways every 20 years. So we're in that paving between 20 and 30 miles of roadway a year to kind of make sure we're not falling behind in that work. So quality is a good way to look at service level. And then lastly, as Chair Robinson referenced, we do have programs that are targeted to certain populations, right? We don't deliver everything to everyone all the time. We have programs that are aimed at accomplishing certain things. So you have kind of population targets for programs that can be a proxy for service. And then the last one is at what cost? And that really dives into the part that Chair Robinson referenced one of the documents that we provided to you, the departmental rates and fees. That hasn't been something that we've aggregated before. So that was another task given to staff, and I think they've done a great job. I would say it's accurate. I wouldn't say it's precise. We have some things to move on there. There's some fees that are on there that really aren't public fees. They're fees that we charge through the Highway Department to the state of Wisconsin for work that we do. So those aren't really things that you have the opportunity to change. So as Chair Robinson referenced, the Register of Deeds is here, Dean. Some of the fees that he charges likewise, we can't say, you know what, we want to jack that fee up for recording this document to increase our revenue because our costs are higher. Those are set by the state of Wisconsin. Similar situation with various fees we have in our court system. So there's that dynamic, but that leads into that document that I talked about. So what are some other big takeaways from the committees that we've had, the discussions that we've had? The first I would say is the order of those questions, the way that Chair Robinson laid them out. Those are really the priority of the discussion that we think is most fruitful. And I'll tell you why. Early on in the budget, the first thing that administration and department heads are going to need to know is if you do have a program that you look at and you say, you know what, I'm not convinced the county needs to be in this business. We need to know that early because that's a big change to say, hey, we want to get out of this business. Or we want to, and I don't want to be the person always talking about cutting. We frequently do. But absolutely, if you have a new program you want to have offer you, the board has a new priority, we can assist you in developing potential program areas or programs within that area to affect the change that you're looking for. I'll give you one example we've used at other committees. A number of years ago, as you know, 3 members of the county board generally attend National Association of Counties conferences. They're your delegates. At the time, it was chair of the Public Safety Committee, who was Vice Chair McEwen. Now, he was chair of Public Safety, and Matt Boots was the chair of Health and Human Services. They attended a NACO conference, both attended a session about the importance of, or the utilization, I should say, of transitional housing for individuals leaving the jail, leaving the correctional system in counties because of the significant costs that are associated with people kind of cycling through. They'd get out, not have stable housing, be reincarcerated, and those costs. A number of counties around the country had developed innovative programs around transitional housing. They had a joint meeting of Health and Human Services and Public Safety, at least one, it might have been a number of joint meetings, talking about what that might look like. We never instituted a new program about it, but it was discussed at, I'll say, a bit of detail. You have the ability to do that. If you have a priority that you identify within your sphere, or you go to another committee and identify that priority, staff can assist you in building that program. But those things take the most time, and we need to have that information earliest in the budget. So the way Chair Robinson laid out the 3 questions, what programs or services, being that first question that we're going to deliver, that was kind of that makes sense in terms of when staff need to know that information earliest in the budget. The levels of service, again, that affects things on the margin. If you want to make significant levels, improvements in quality, that's, of course, a more dramatic change we need to build into the budget than perhaps a smaller change in quality that might not ultimately have any financial impact. It might be a process change we can make. And then the last piece that can come later in the budget, certainly fees. Rates and fees do have a small impact. I shouldn't say small. They have a moderate impact on the budget. You'll recall from the pie chart. They're not insignificant. They're in that 10% area of overall impact on the county budget for fees, rates and fees that we charge. But that is something that you can modify throughout the budget. They have an impact. If you're going to decrease the camping fees, if the board elects to move that will have we have a fair amount of camping that we do in the county. If you decrease the fees in such an amount, at such a level that we have $100,000 of less revenue, the county has a balanced budget. If you have $100,000 of less revenue, we're going to have to find $100,000 of less expense. So rates and fees in terms of timing can come later. So those are some big takeaways. And on the rates and fees, topic, one of the ideas that, one of the requests that came out of the committees was really helping the committees by trying to provide information from the staff perspective as best we can, what the fee philosophy is the term we've used, what the fee philosophy has been within that department for those particular fees. And again, fees aren't set by the department, they're set by either a standing committee, if it's been delegated to a standing committee, or in the case of the Board of Health, the board rules have delegated to Board of Health the responsibility to set those fees. Park Commission sets fees for parks programs. But, you know, a fee philosophy guides that. If the philosophy that the board wants for camping, for example, is that it covers 100% of the fully loaded direct and indirect costs, that might align with a certain fee, versus if our target is 75% cost recovery, let's say for a certain permit delivered by Conservation Planning and Zoning, because there's a public good component that the committee has identified, we think this should be 25% funded by general public revenues, 75% on the applicant. Whereas the fees we have at the landfill, I've used the landfill as an example for enterprise funds, that is 100% fully costed out, such as the fees. It's a fee-supported operation. So we're working on having those conversations with the committees to, as best we can, give our perspective on what we understand the fee philosophy that the committees have adopted in those areas. So that's one takeaway. Second big takeaway from the committee discussion to this point in my mind is, as Chair Robinson referenced, it's natural to talk about, and a number of committees did say, well, shouldn't we talk about levy? Start talking about what's our levy goal we're trying to accomplish. And through those discussions, I think we arrived at an outcome where, again, it's helpful to think back to the budget orientation and kickoff meeting we had. The levy is going to, in some respect, this is an oversimplification, but it's going to take care of itself. Your operating levy is going to be what it is. Your operating levy is set by last year's levy, plus any amount you're able to add through net new construction and TID closures. Your operating levy, you will, because you are a very fiscally minded local government, you'll maximize your operating levy because that's the best way you can control cost of county government. So it's not a very fruitful area to start the discussions. Instead, as Chair Robinson referenced, it's those three policy questions that we think are more important. However, when you do get to the idea about what programs and services do we want to deliver, of course, cost and levy general funding matters. And building on what Chair Robinson referenced, as is the case with a lot of the discussion you're going to have, it's complex. That 5-year budget summary, we'll use social services because that was the last one I believe Chair Robinson referenced. 34% of that departmental budget is funded by tax levy. However, do not take that 34% number to indicate that all programs within social services are 34% levy. That is not the case. We have some programs that are 100% tax levy funded. Community response is one. And we have other programs that are 100% funded by other funding sources, not tax levy. Children's long-term support, our comprehensive community services program are generally fully funded through the state. So the percentages are helpful. It's helpful to guide the discussion. Another good example, the highway department, not all highways are created equal. We do work on state highways that's 100% reimbursed. So cutting a dollar in the highway department is not cutting a dollar, particularly if it relates to a state activity on a state roadway. Our routine maintenance agreement with the state of Wisconsin, we're fully reimbursed for that. So that leads me to my final takeaway. The thing we heard from the first committee all the way through our one yesterday, this is a lot of information. Absolutely true. It is a lot, and it's meant to start the discussion based on the feedback, as all of you heard during the budget process. So we have a number of department heads that are here to answer questions, starting with that first policy question. What are the programs and services you want to deliver? If you have questions, hey, what does this program even mean? Please ask now. If it occurs to you outside of the meeting, send me an email. Certainly to Chair Robinson and myself, we'll get the information you need. But we recognize it is a lot. It's a complex budget, but we certainly think it's a more involved process for each of the departments.
I do have a question for you and Chris, and that deals with the facilities and capital, or the facilities budget, because within that, we are charging rent to a number of state agencies and others, and it's not reflected in our rates and fees, but I know that it's there. And are we at market? You know, that might be something for us to look at, where we are relative to market and in direct and in indirect cost relative to capture those when those agreements are up for renewal.
We can tell you what the rates are that we've frequently charged. I want to say our current rate is $18.95, right around $19 a square foot annually. However, the thing that makes our lease rates a little bit, of course, you need to compare apples to apples, right? And every lease is always a little bit different. Our leases, generally speaking, you referenced state agencies. So in this very building, right below our feet, maybe not right below our feet, but maybe over there a little bit, is the Department of Corrections. They rent from us, and we pay. Its utilities are included, heat is included. We provide certain levels of data access, data service, custodial. So it is a very much full service lease as opposed to some of the leases you might otherwise see. And you see rental rates. We've talked with the ADRC, the Aging Disability Resource Center of Central Wisconsin. The rental rates that you might see on the private market are generally not that. You ultimately have to go out and procure a lot of those services yourself. But the rental rates are significantly lower than that all-in rate. But we think when we load them in, particularly in buildings that we're already in, we come out better for the organizations we're renting to, but also we're covering our costs. That's my sense, Chris, that we're at least covering our costs. I don't know if you have anything you want to add. You have to have it. We'll grab you a mic.
Or if you want to just join us at the table?
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Chair. No, I think the goal is what Lance was saying in terms of recouping the costs. I think that, as we've looked at doing leases for people down in the A and B space, we've looked at the consistency across the board in terms of what we're charging other entities too, so that there's not, you're not playing favorites, or if there's some sort of in-kind piece to it, you've identified that. But I think that part of moving forward is going to be kind of drilling down into that to make sure that as we're looking at the increased utility costs and things like that, that those are captured as much as you can anyway within those sorts of agreements.
I would say the other benefit of some of the way that we're, again, leasing our space in this building, the building is what it is, and the Department of Corrections, we would be heating and cooling that space, whether there are staff there or not. Now, of course, with staff and computers and all the other things that we bring, utility costs do go up. But generally speaking, the best information we have, I think we're covering our costs. But is there an opportunity to get more granular with that? I think absolutely. And it's certainly a goal that I think we want to, one area where we have an opportunity, this is my sense, is making sure we have any rental revenue that's coming in for a particular building, a portion of that gets set aside for capital investment. If you think about how you would handle it if you were a private landlord, right? You don't take all of your rental revenue and put it back into current operations. That's not covering your cost. You want to have a portion of that go into a fund for capital improvements. I think we have some opportunities to improve our long-term capital plan through implementing that sort of policy.
Go ahead, Gail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it would be helpful if we had some idea when those fees were last changed. If it's been 10 years since we looked at them, then that would indicate that we probably need to make a change. Secondly, with the formal end of the COVID emergency, how will that change the budget going into 2024 would be a helpful update.
Sure. That second question, I think, is going to be a bit more challenging to answer. It may bring some, I know it will bring some changes in revenue to the health department. Some of their grant programs are, those funding streams are going to end. That said, I've already had conversations with the health officer. We've been ratcheting down those programs for a great many months, quite honestly, and we're more likely to terminate the program and send the unused funds back to the state than keep them continuing. With respect to your earlier question, I should have referenced relative to at least rent. We do have an escalator clause in all of our leases that they go up 2% annually. One of the things we've seen in some of our comparisons with private leases, most recently with the ADRC, was they had a 3% every other year. So I think we're in the ballpark of what some private entities are doing, of 2% cost escalators. But with respect to other fees, that is an area where certainly we have opportunities. You may recall at the last board meeting, the board approved increasing some fees with respect to the health department. There is a statutory cap on our ability to do that annually with respect to, did I say health department? I meant medical examiner's office if I said the wrong one. Medical examiner's office is capped at CPI, the last 12-month increase in CPI. But we hadn't increased that. I believe it was, since it was implemented, Mike, was at 2016. So we hadn't taken advantage of that statutory provision to give us that, and you can't add up what has changed from 2016 to 2023, so we could only go back the 12-month CPI change to implement that. But to your point, reviewing those every year, I think, is a really good practice. That would be best practice. I think that is one of the things that drove us from the staff perspective to put together that fee document. And I think I said this at the board level during the orientation kickoff. My intent is to have that as an appendice to the administrator's budget, so you see it. Each and every year, you're going to see the rate and fee schedule, so you know what our rates are. And not only our rates for the current year, but best practice next year is to have what was 2023 and what is 2024, so that you can always see what the increase is.
And I guess the ask would be to focus on the big dollar ones first, the things that drive a lot of cost, a lot of revenue. I know we made significant improvements or capital improvements to several of the parks buildings. Ice rinks come to mind, and just that's probably where the focus should be at this point in time. Thank you.
Other, Chair Gibbs.
Well, looking at the 5-year summary, I think there's a way to solve all of the problems, and that is just create 2 new departments, a second treasurer's department, and a second register of deeds department, because they are negative in impact, and we solve all the problems. Oh, maybe not, huh? Just.
I don't think we'll realize quite the same returns if we do duplicate the efforts. And Dean would wonder if he's, who he's answering to. Or I'm going to just ask a question on our employee resources side, and maybe plant the seed for an evaluation. I know that as part of some of the pandemic roll down, some of the credits for childcare are going away, and we want to attract and retain employees. Are there challenges that will result from that relative to our workforce? And are there some opportunities for us to address that in this budget, and should we address it? And I know that there are other people that are working on it, other committees that are looking at it at a community level, but I'm asking the question as it relates to us as an employer.
Is this
And
on?
welcome back.
Thank you. I'm sure that it'll impact us as an employer. I don't know to what extent, how many employees are going to struggle, but we lose employees on a relatively regular basis due to childcare concerns. And so losing any additional funding or assistance that they've had to be able to afford and obtain childcare will certainly impact our employees. Again, I'm not sure to what extent. Is there something we can do? I would imagine so, but I don't have a formal plan in place at this time. So, Administrator Leonard, if you have anything to add,
Yeah,
please do.
That's a tough question. So my understanding of the changes that are coming at the state level, to your point, it's the funding from the state that was going to the child care providers that allowed them to charge, to more effectively retain staff, are going away. So if they operate like a great many businesses operate, they had a tool they were using to offset some of their operational costs. That tool is being taken away. Their operational costs are not going to be able to be reduced by the amount that revenue that they're losing. My sense is they're going to do what every business does and pass that along to the consumer, in this case, parents and caregivers. And what we know about the cost of childcare is it's already financially untenable for many. So to Molly's point, what impact that's going to have is really going to be individualized by the people receiving care. Because the flip side of the coin is, if it was simply about money, there are a lot of people who could pay for care. There just wasn't care available. There still isn't the amount of care available. So yes, I think Molly's spot on. Is it going to have an impact? Absolutely. How much? Difficult to say. Are there things we can do? Absolutely. We've talked about this committee about one of the projects at the A&B building that we're trying to evaluate, about a public-private partnership for operation in that space. That too is limited by the general workforce shortages we're seeing, not only but certainly in childcare, but across the board. I do know one of the opportunities as an employer that we would have, and this would be 100% driven by the board, there has been a program through the state of Wisconsin, and the last I had heard is that it was going to be reauthorized. I don't know if that will come to pass, but the program was called the Partner Up program. You'll recall we applied for the Dream Up grant, which we received, which was a strategic planning grant. Partner Up is a grant program where employers make application to the state of Wisconsin, where the employer, through the grant, is indicating they're essentially promising to pay a certain portion of the true cost of childcare. And if you are selected to receive the grant, the state picks up the other significant portion of that cost of care. So it's essentially ensuring that the childcare provider they receive the true cost of childcare. My understanding is that there were a number of entities that have applied for that funding. I was surprised in our community that, quite honestly, more did not. I don't believe there's any prohibition on local governments applying. However, I certainly appreciate that in some respects, governments are different. If private business decides to allocate their general revenues to offset to a child care benefit, they can do that. I'm not aware of, I think 2 companies in our area applied for and received the Partner Up grant. My recollection were actually child care providers. Child care providing entities that for their staff then were agreeing to kind of pay for that portion of care. That's one opportunity, and then there are certainly a great many public employers and private employers that have child care benefits, direct subsidy to individuals, but certainly we don't have that at this point. If the board wants us to put together, if this committee wants us to put together a draft for your consideration, we can certainly do that and come up with some cost estimates. But I would certainly anticipate an impact. As Molly said, we have people that have been employees, go out on leave with all intent to come back, and week 11,
3 this month.
3 this month, she said. So week 11, we get a call. It's like, can't find anybody. I'm really sorry. Yeah, I mean, it happens. I dropped off 2 big totes of books to a former employee here that had that exact experience.
Other questions? Supervisor Hart and then Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that I had heard from this discussion in another committee, and one of the things I want to make sure that we are also looking at is the funding for nonprofits. And I know that I think Public Safety had a discussion on Judicare and women's community. And that in my book, that's done. That they've talked about it. They've kind of gone through that. I want to make sure if there's any nonprofit funding that we might be facilitated in some way, that we also have those discussions, and then ask that any of the other committees too have those. What I want to avoid, and it's kind of, the whole point of this process, is to condense down what would be a couple of meetings to discuss really important topics on programs, to have that over the course of the year and not in the month to 2 weeks that it takes for the entire board to consider the budget. And I know that was one of the things that happened last time, was the end of that discussion on nonprofits was, it's not that we shouldn't be having this conversation, it's just we've had a full year to have this conversation, and now we're just having this in the little time that we have. So I want to make sure that we're keeping that on either our committee or any of the other committees' agendas, so that they have those discussions. So at the end of this process, when I'm assuming that there's going to be another amendment to cut all the nonprofits, just because that seems to happen every year. We can say that we've had this discussion and this is the result of that discussion, where we don't have to talk about that at the very end in an abbreviated time period. Thanks.
Those would fall under the committees of jurisdiction, and Public Safety has had discussions with both the women's community and with the Judicare and the program. We've raised those discussions with both the Health and Human Services Committee and Education Extension, Economic Development, relative to the Community Action Program funding, the Historical Society funding, the Women's Community funding, and 211 funding. So we've encouraged them to invite those programs in during the course of the year to get a better understanding of how those relate to the county's mission and develop that understanding. So that is being done. Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As far as going back to that whole childcare discussion, which just makes my heart break, because I have been studying the ALICE report, which is the asset limited, income constrained, and employed. Our working poor are really struggling, especially our single parents. And I don't know, what would you say would be a benefit? I mean, or do we not even have child care safety programs, or not safety, savings programs, the tax benefit for that? Or so what would be something that could be put together for a benefit for our staff, just to keep them?
I'll take a first crack. I think there's a lot of stuff if you want to innovate, there's programs out there that employers are doing all over the place, from direct subsidy. I think we've done a lot of everything within the scope of our operations. I shouldn't say everything. A great many things within the scope of our operations I think we've done. Trying to be as flexible as possible with, scheduling start times to allow people to, have the grace to take their kids to school at 8:15 and start 15 minutes after, so that they don't have to pay for childcare for the 1 hour minimum. We can work around that. we've done a lot of those things, but it could be, there are employers that do direct subsidy for childcare. There are, the opportunity, it's not direct for childcare, but it's a kind of family centered benefit of, assisting more directly in the setting up of college savings accounts and other things that help the population you're talking about that, asset limited, income constrained and employed, so focused on today and making ends meet in this month's expenses that it's hard to think about the expenses that are going to come up in the future. It's certainly hard to think about expenses that are 18 years in the future. I mean, we can help do things to assist them in that are relatively easy. I mean, it just takes staff resources to help them set up one of those child savings accounts. But we'd be looking to the board, and I said this at our previous meeting. Thank you for the question. It caused me to remember this. The Wisconsin Counties Association, the National Association of Counties, there are a great many resources on those websites. If you want to find an innovative program, you can look there and you can see what other counties are doing. That's one of the tools that we utilize to come up with the nurse family partnership model, as opposed to it's a transition away from our start rate model. So if you want to find programs or innovative approaches, those are some areas to look. And if you want to direct staff to do that, we can do some evaluation. Certainly I can reach out to the Chamber of Commerce and ask them what some of our local partners local businesses are doing. Molly can reach out to her contacts within HR systems around the state. So I know that's not a great answer because I'm not telling you there are 4 things to do, but I think there's a lot of things to do. But it's a question, again, I fully appreciate that we have limited resources within the county, financial resources, and you as policymakers would need to help us allocate those if you want to go in that direction.
Chair Gibbs.
And I'm not sure that we have the answer to this question yet, but I think it's something that's definitely valuable in evaluating, and that is there's got to be a effective cost benefit analysis of if we were to subsidize childcare versus paying overtime and or paying additional benefits for an individual that is separated in training, because that obviously costs us additional resources to get somebody that we just lost because they can't find childcare. Now we have to train somebody, or we're paying overtime to somebody to cover that time frame where that individual is not. And so I think that we need to have that information, because that information is going to direct, how we actually fill those vacancies, or stop losing, employees because of that. If we don't, we're going to be, again, we're going to find ourselves behind the 8 ball. Granted, maybe the community is not there yet, but I think we need to innovate and find ways to do that. So I would be very interested in doing a cost benefit analysis in comparison to offering, whether it be reduced child care or direct child care, in comparison to benefits cost and or overtime cost and loss of and retraining costs on employees, because I think there's clearly a potential benefit to the county and the taxpayer.
I think in light of the time, I'm going to maybe move us on to the budget priorities, just because we have a reporting relationship or obligation to the county board. We wanted today to introduce the process. All of the other committees are going to be, taking some time to look at them, but I would like to continue this discussion. Take the documents, think about it in the context of the fees, in the revenue, the rates and fees. Look at those services. Most of the departments that report to us are pretty standard. We're maintaining buildings. We're doing the work of the state. We're administering elections. There's not a great deal of flexibility within the committees that report to us per se. Corporation Counsel is doing protective placements, and he's our county's attorney, so there's not a lot of discretion in there. If we get rid of the Corporation Counsel, we hire private attorneys, it probably costs us more with less access. But think of, are there some other issues? But I think the one area where we can impact it is a discussion we sort of had on childcare, maybe perhaps a discussion we had on, can we squeeze some more efficiencies in our buildings through doing minor tweaks to equipment, replacing light bulbs, focus on energy, accessing some of those other things. I was at a MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, meeting yesterday where both Mosinee and WASA put in applications for some dollars to replace light bulbs, and there's a very quick payback on those. And if we can do that in, for instance, our parks and park lighting and parking lot lighting, maybe we will realize some energy savings. So, but keep those things in mind, and we'll move them. This will be a standing item on our agenda for the foreseeable future. But we do need to move into the discussion of the priorities. So, any quick questions before we do that? Cody?
Sorry, just one quick question on the process. Is this going to be a standing item on every committee's agenda for the, again, foreseeable future? That's more of a question for administration.
I think that's more aptly to the committee chairs. My understanding is that's kind of been the message, that it should be a recurring item.
Obviously, we need to get that input in a timely manner to make it meaningful for the development of the budget. So we'll probably talk about that a little bit tomorrow at exec. I would imagine, and what sort of timelines and time frames that we would want that input. But obviously, the ultimate arbitrator of any decision relative to the budget is the county board, and that county board in the adoption of the budget can change anything. Pretty much in the budget. So I think what we're doing is trying to prepare it and try to be as inclusive in that process and that lead up to that as possible. So with that, any other questions? All right, let's move into the budget priorities, and I'm going to turn it over to the administrator, because what he's done is, again, we look to St. Croix County as sort of a guiding county in terms of the development of our policy and approach. And he's put forth a draft resolution for discussion.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I try not to belabor the point, but that draft resolution is largely from St. Croix County, like the process that the board adopted itself. Just to kind of frame out within your packet what the priorities ultimately through the budget priority identification process are going to be for the county board. And again, your kind of the decision matrix, which we shared previously, and I think I can pull that up. That's this document. The decision matrix has a couple of key areas: capital reserves, employee compensation, health insurance or health care costs approach, I would guess. And then position expansion or contraction, and finally operating expenses. Those are the kind of bucket areas, I'll say. And then on the right, of course, when you assign the priority to each of those bucket areas, the information on the right is kind of the decision-making matrix that administration in St. Croix has largely gone through in terms of, okay, the board has indicated employee compensation, for example, is a 2, what does that mean? And then it gives that direction to administration. Of course, this board, this committee, and ultimately the board made some tweaks to that matrix. I'll call them moderate tweaks, but overall, that's the matrix that's before you. So my goal today, and I understand you've already been here for a while, my goal was to give you information to help you do that prioritization process. So I just want to give you a little bit of an update on some numbers that I think, based on our budget orientation kickoff meeting, that may be of value to you. And the first is on the revenue side. We talked about net new construction at the budget kickoff. I think the numbers we have for net new construction are, I think you can look in the Green Book, and historically, again, we're in that 1.7-ish, 1.5 to 2.0 area. And what you think about, maybe with the economy tightening up, which I'm sure everyone is hearing, that's kind of the outlook, that number might be reduced a little bit. So you're in that 500,000 to maybe $750,000 of new revenue from net new construction, which is largely consistent to where we've been. Sales tax, however, we did get some new numbers on sales tax. This was from the budget kickoff, was through the end of March. We had about 4 million. I can tell you that I just checked this morning. So through the end of April, the total is just above 5 million. So it's moving very similarly. We're about 33% of our budgeted amount, and we're only 25% through the year. That said, I referenced the economy tightening up before. We've talked about Dale Knapp before. You guys have had Dale Knapp come before you. He recently was at a luncheon that's been widely quoted around the state of Wisconsin, held just at the end of April through WISP Politics and WISP Business. And as the head of Forward Analytics, he did make very clear, predicting a recession in the second half of the year, not expecting a major downturn. He didn't provide a lot of elaboration on what he was predicting, but probably be a little bit more than mild was his quote. So, quote, probably a little bit more than mild. So my sense, you can interpret what you will, but I think given kind of where we're at, a sales tax adopted budget number, perhaps a little bit above what we anticipated in 2023 may make sense, but I don't think we want to change our conservative approach that we referenced during that orientation kickoff of making sure that, again, sales tax is that tool that if you have a good year, what it does is it allows you to have that rollover the year following the audit to fund capital expenditures in a way that does not increase the cost of local government projects through borrowing. So it also, apart from that, that's the kind of positive outlook. Assuming a more pessimistic outlook, it also protects against economic downturn, a conservative estimate. It's a lot easier to be faced with the prospect of what to do with revenue you didn't expect than what to do with expenditures that exceed your expected revenues. So do with that what you will, but I wanted to provide you that updated information relative to those sales tax figures. The only other additional information I'll provide on state shared revenue, this slide, which was again in the kickoff, shows you the experience we've had, and it's been largely status quo, as you can see, not a whole lot of variation. And I'm a member of the Optimist Club, but I like to think I'm realistically optimistic. There's been a lot of discussion about state shared revenue and in the media about there's a deal, then there's not a deal, now there's a deal again, and a deal that may be vetoed. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but the last report that we've heard, and you would have gotten this report on the Wisconsin Counties Association calls, if things work out as has been reported, best case scenario I would say right now is a 10% increase in shared revenues, which for us is about that $380,000. That's assuming positive things come about. $380,000 of increased revenues, as you all know, and we'll talk about some other assumptions you're going to have to weigh as you come up with these priorities. And then certainly when you get to your budget assumption phase, as Chair Robinson referenced later, you'll have to think about it's far less than inflation, right? And on our overall budget, $380,000, certainly a significant amount of money, but it's not going to be something that you can say, wow, all of our challenges are gone. It will be helpful, but not life-changing. So that's on the state aid side. That kind of gives you an idea of what the what the lay of the land is. Here, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea on some experiences, and for whatever reason, this isn't coming up right fashion. But in terms of wage numbers, I want to commend the board for, in this committee, for sure, for its actions last year in adopting the class compensation study. I think we saw a lot of positive change from that implementation. Again, similar to my last comments, we were very conservative in that implementation. You'll recall the direction from our consultant was, you should move further. We were, no, let's get us to where we need to be today, and we will just have the ongoing commitment to make those changes as they're needed moving forward. So with the tightening labor force, the general information, what we're seeing is that companies are still looking for the increases. What we're hearing, the 3% area. Last year, you'll remember there were counties that did 8%. Still more information to come with, as the economy, it looks like, is going to continue to tighten. I don't think we need to be, I think we can be, 3% would be the most that I would ask as your administrator to put in. I think we can refine that number as we move closer to your budget assumption work. And I think that's consistent with what employers you're seeing, that they're in that up to 3%. I'm not hearing the significant shifts that we were hearing last year. Still, certainly a very competitive market, as you've talked about to this point. In your childcare discussion and your other discussion, we're still seeing challenge areas. I don't want to paint a picture that is not realistic. If anyone, I brought this up at the Towns Association meetings, each of the meetings that I attended. If anyone knows anyone interested in what I think would be a great career of being a corrections officer, let us talk to you about it. We can convey that information to people. Still a fair number of areas where we're experiencing challenge, but it's not that, I don't see that sea change that we saw in last year. So that's on the wage side in terms of the expense side. Similarly with expense, this is just found a consumer price index for the Midwest region through April. You'll see, just as we've kind of anecdotally experienced, that inflation rate is still hovering around that 5% area, but it's tempering slightly. So putting that in perspective, Jim Griesbach, our highway commissioner in a recent infrastructure committee, it's not 5% across the board with everything. Certain areas are more acutely impacted than other. Highway is one. Our material costs within the highway department for asphalt and all of its constituent elements is greater than what you're seeing on that. But just to give you some context on where the rest of the kind of consumer price index market is looking, that's where that is, at least according to this website, through 2023. The one interesting thing I'll add about this, and I'm certainly not an expert, we don't have numbers from our health insurance, through our health insurance and healthcare assessment process that's ongoing in terms of what's our cost to continue our renewals moving forward. I just recently read an article talking about kind of an odd experience that they're seeing, that traditionally healthcare inflation has outpaced general inflation. With the significant increase in general inflation, they actually saw that invert which is a relative rarity, that the healthcare inflation rate was below the general inflation rate. And you'll recall from our budget book last year and our budget discussions, we've actually been in a very strong position relative to healthcare based on our preventative work that we've done through Molly's office, and the programs that we put together, and just our experience in working with our current insurance provider. But certainly that's something we're going to continue, but to give you that information. And building on the inflation piece, Chair Robinson referenced this relative to utilities. To ground everyone again, recalling back to our 2023 budget building process, when you get into your budget priority matrix here, and it really relates to the capital reserve piece, the first bucket, and the operational budget request, the last bucket. It's important to remember where we're starting this year. We had $400,000 of utilities approximately $400,000 worth of utilities that we funded with one-time funds, those ARPA funds. So absent making some changes, which we are evaluating, Chris and his team are constantly doing that to bring those costs down, and certainly through the relocation of the social services building, we anticipate seeing some modifications there. In the latter part of the year, we'll hopefully be able to kind of decommission some of our utilization of some of our River Drive buildings to see some cost savings there. But it's important to, again, recognize that we're starting from that $400,000 operating, essentially a deficit on the operating side, because we use those one-time funds. And you also used reserve funds, as you'll recall, in terms of your debt service, which one-time funds to essentially buy down that tax rate through the debt service levy. Those same funds aren't available for you to utilize this year. So I know that was still a lot, but wanted to give you the context of, here are what I think are some important pieces of information for you to consider as you provide insight at that holistic level. We were just talking about what programs and services, at what level and at what cost. That's more granular, more micro level of how you impact the budget from the standing committee and ultimately the board level. This is more across the board. When we're talking about things like employee compensation, health insurance, those are global. We don't have one department that has a health plan that's different than anyone else. We certainly have a makeup of employee population that in every department, each department might have a different percentage of people on the family plan or the individual plan or not taking our health insurance, but that's not a department consideration. That's a you as the board. How do we want to look at our health insurance benefit? How do we look at our employee compensation? Administration and HR then affect that across the departmental budgets, and then we challenge department leadership with really diving into the operational side of their budget to make sure we're being as efficient as we can be. So that's a high-level overview, Mr. Chair, of those pieces of information. If anyone has any questions, happy to try to elaborate, or we can start to talk through from the staff perspective kind of where we see our priorities in light of kind of local government and the general economic outlook.
And could you share the decision matrix for operating budget priorities as well? It wasn't, I just realized it wasn't in the packet. I hit it in.
Oh, sure. It was actually I can find what packets it's in for people to pull up, but I can also email it.
I think that would be helpful as we begin this discussion. But are there questions of Administrator Leonard? He sort of got into some of the assumptions that, that we'll be using, that we'll be talking about later once we have a better understanding of where the economy is going. I know the Legislative Fiscal Bureau is scheduled to release their projections early next week. And that's what the legislature will use to drive their work on the budget, so we can pay attention to those. And ultimately, the state budget does have a very real impact upon us in terms of shared revenues, general transportation aids, and other things. So we'll look at those. But I think today what we're looking to do is, if we can get done today, great. If we need to come back the day of the county board meeting and finalize our work on this, that's an option. But try to identify what we consider to be the priorities. And the resolution has a number of those outlined, five outlined. And if there are no questions relative to his assumptions, and then maybe we can go through what the thoughts are in structural deficit, employee compensation, and others, and if you have others that you'd like to add.
And I just want to say that draft where they're in the resolution and they're in order, that is not my recommendation of order I just listed. them within the resolution. I can't even recall what the order was, but if you have questions about kind of what, from an administration perspective, what our current state is and where our priorities operationally may be, I'm happy to try to elaborate on that.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, you mentioned that they weren't in any logical order, but when you look at them, number one being the structural deficit, and understanding what that is, I think we, as a finance committee, HR finance committee, know that utilizing and creating a structural deficit long term is not something sustainable. So I think that is an absolute critical priority. Number two, what you have is employee compensation. Obviously, without employees, we can't deliver the services, and so I think that does fit into the number two. Number three, health insurance. Again, it's relating to the benefits that we're providing to our employees and the value that they see of that insurance. Net new positions, obviously, net new positions. Historically, we know that we're saddled with levy limits and income constraints that are put upon us. I think net new positions do fit into the number 4 position. And then lastly, or maybe the net new positions in number 5 could be operating expenses could be reversed. But I think those are, in my view, a very good ordering of what we actually need to set as priorities moving forward. Again, structural deficit, it doesn't, to me, you don't continue to run a business creating structural deficits. That's not just sustainable. Employee compensation, without employees, we can't deliver the service. Health insurance is a result of that, and so benefits. So if we change our philosophy on health insurance and try to add additional costs to the employee by not raising the cost of the health insurance that the employer pays, if health insurance continues to go up, might be really challenging because it's counterproductive. New positions, as long as we're able to continue to provide the services, I think is, spot on, or operating expenses could be reversed, but that's my take on it.
I tend to agree with that, but do we have a good definition of structural deficit? Because I think that's critical. Is it the use of reserves? Is it the use of one-time money, albeit continued availability with ARPA? What does a structural deficit mean, both in the 2024 budget and the immediate budgets and then going forward? So I think we need some definition.
And I don't know that I can elaborate on the definition. I think that is the terminology that was utilized in the St. Croix County resolution. Up on the screen in the room, you'll see that we actually this committee termed it capital reserves. And if you would identify capital reserves as a number 1 priority, it's do not utilize capital reserves in the budget building process for operations. And the situation in which you would do that is if you did start with a structural deficit, as Chair Gibbs referenced, as opposed to a 2 or a lower. That's really a kind of an ordinal measure where, if it's still a number 2 priority, you might use it very minimally, whereas if it's number 5, you might use it to a higher level. And the only other thing I'll say with respect to Chair Gibbs's suggestions, I might, as your administrator, if I had to prioritize right now, I referenced before, I think we're in a much stronger position. We still have challenges, as I said, with respect to employee compensation, but the way that we implement employee compensation adjustments is through our pay for performance approach. And again, that's of overall payroll. I think a priority level of 3 for employee compensation, that's up to, again, under the matrix you approved, it's 3% and below. I think if we were to have 3%, we can do we can be where we need to be for next year. With a priority level 3, I think health insurance, to your point earlier, Chair Gibbs, is a higher priority that I explained this, I think, in response to a question, I can't recall at what committee, there was a generalized question, I think it was public safety, about our benefits and the value of our benefits. And I didn't have the figures, of course, in the moment, but I characterized it as, I think, if you ask 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you would ask people to characterize just government health care benefits and government benefits in general, there was this characterization that they're far and away above those of the private sector. I don't think that is the case any longer. We still have a strong benefit plan. We need to articulate it better, but that gap, real and perceived, is either gone or significantly minimized. There are a lot of other organizations that do a lot more innovative things than we're doing. Not making a judgment about that. It's just my perception is that that gap has shrunk. So I think we would have we would be better served by prioritizing maintaining the value of our health plan benefits and employee benefits at the level they are, and allow compensation to fall into that third tier than the other way around. Because I think, quite honestly, that's an area where we have more opportunity as well. I know Supervisor Marshall has had some brief conversations with me about some things to look at, and I do think there's opportunity for us to be innovative in that space to maintain the quality of the plan and potentially actually improve the quality of the plan in a more cost-effective way than on the comp side.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know one of the things that was on the administrative work plan, and I understand that that is a very lengthy document, so no criticism other than, are we still on the perception that we're moving toward a self-funded plan to allow us to have more flexibility and in maintaining benefits at a lower cost to the county?
Do you want to take that?
We certainly have the intention of going out to see what their self-funded options are, and we will let cost and the decision of this body lead that. But we do have the intention to go out and see what the costing is for self-funded options.
What does that timeline look like? So we're having those discussions early in the process.
Please use the microphone.
And my question would be, when are we having those informational discussions soon enough to impact the process in the budget so it's not a last-minute thing?
Yes, we are working with USI, our consultants, and they will be starting that process in June.
Could I ask you at one of our upcoming meetings just to give us an update of what that looks like, so we've got an understanding?
Absolutely.
Chair Gibbs.
Yeah, just to maybe explain why I felt that employee compensation needed to be where it needed to be is, we just went through a pretty extensive process of looking at how, in some cases, we had fallen behind. And one of the things that our consultant had clearly made clear is that we needed to maintain our compensation so that we didn't have to do another pay study relatively soon. And so I'm not disagreeing. I think a 3% increase for compensation is maybe something that we could look at, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we went through, we had a consultant, we did a pay study, but obviously was 8 years prior to that we had did the last one, but from from the 8 years till last year, we didn't do enough adjusting because of inflation, and we fell behind. And I don't want to get in that same position and have it to do a significant increase to not be competitive in the market space.
Other thoughts? Do we want to go through and just make sure we've got perhaps our arms around each of those areas, and then we can prioritize at the end of that process? So as we I don't know if anybody has other items that they'd like to put in, but the structural deficit, we sort of had the use of reserves, and I would argue we have the use of ARPA for operating expenses that we would want to make sure, well, it's a fallback. We can't sustain it beyond 2026, and we can't encumber, it's hard to encumber beyond 2024 into the 25 budget, so we really have next year's budget in which to wean ourselves of that. So I think is there a directive in the priorities on how we're going to deal with the structural deficit?
I think that's a great point, and one of the reasons I like this approach for a lot of reasons, but just what you alluded to, the idea that every year really is different. But with advanced planning and some forethought, you can approach these things differently. The other part I'll add, I referenced before that you service debt using capital reserves. Important to remember that the reason you did that is because of the fiscal challenges that North Central Healthcare was having as a result of a number of things. Again, most recently the pandemic and its impact on the overall nursing home environment. But using those ARPA funds to serve as a funding mechanism for capital expenditures for the 2024 budget, next year's budget, provided you also evaluate, and perhaps it's time to have a temporary deviation from your standard capital reserve process to allow for the board to kind of insulate itself, mitigate risk to the taxpayer should North Central not be able to ratchet up its debt service ability through 2027, because you'll recall from I can pull that slide up. From the budget kickoff discussion that was had, you'll recall we had a chart on, I believe this is the chart, county outstanding debt. The new debt service obligations for North Central in this will be the third column from the right. It ratchets up significantly. Next year, 2024, the idea is for them to service $2 million of debt. However, their true debt obligation that year is closer to $4 million. So you'll see that it actually increases from $2 million by $500,000 in 2025, again in 2026, 2027, and the full impact of their total debt obligation doesn't kind of truly kick in until 2028. You have that $4.13 million. So with a temporary adjustment, some utilization of ARPA funds, as Chair Robinson referenced in 2024 through your budget building process, temporary modification perhaps of your capital reserve process, and I've been toying with this for a while, seeing what other counties are doing. There are some ways that we can change our policy to have perhaps some of those funds, if it's the will of the board, to be identified for segregation for purposes of capital, which you currently do, but also a debt service fund with the specific idea that you'd utilize it for that should North Central not be able to service that debt. Nobody knows what the next several years are going to be with North Central's ability to do that. They're making a lot of changes that I think I look at from a positive perspective, but that's still a significant operational lift to get to that $4.1 million. So to Chair Robinson's point, think it's really important. I would agree, capital reserves, that idea of structural deficit is really, that strategy is a top priority through your budget priority setting process. I don't know if that makes sense, if I did a good job of articulating that, but that's kind of the environment you're in.
So how does that manifest itself in this resolution?
I think if the direction is capital, how I envision utilizing this, if you were to say capital reserves, not utilizing capital reserves in the budget building process, if that's the direction you want to give, that would mean capital reserves is number one in this terminology. Again, it says structural deficit, but I can change that to capital reserves. If then you determine, what does employee compensation look like? How much of a priority is it? I think Chair Gibbs made a lot of very good points.
Could I stop you there?
Yeah.
Could we deal with these one at a time? So, and then what I would like to do is develop.
Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevator.
School, you be timed. You got 1 minute to get out of the building. Go.
Fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building.
You don't take your
Do
stuff.
not use the elevator.
No,
Attention,
what
fire alarm
I want
has
to do
been
is
activated.
just agree
Please
that
walk to the
these are
nearest exit and
the
exit the
items, what
building.
they are.
Do not use the elevators.
Sure, sounds good.
Otherwise, we'll be.
Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevators. Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevators.
Jail alarm, they said.
It's a jail alarm.
Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevators. Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevators.
Only a test.
Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the
I was
elevators.
watching a documentary a couple weeks ago, and
Attention,
there's tests
fire
went
alarm
on
has been activated.
2 points.
Please
You know,
walk to the
they're
nearest
giving
exit and
good
exit the
information.
building.
Sitting there.
Do not use the elevators. Attention,
public
fire
access.
alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevators. Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevators. Attention, fire alarm has been activated. Please walk to the nearest exit and exit the building. Do not use the elevators.
So how does that get shut off?
Attention, fire alarm.
No, it's still going. We can't meet. That's going on. I have a 6 o'clock city.
I was right here. It's on tape to prove it.
This is kind of like tornado drills, and then we have one during the Community for All discussion.
I'll go see if we're back.
I don't think he shut it off. I don't think he ever left, Lance.
I'm just gonna make sure you turn it back.
Sure.
Oh, we must be on a hot topic. I go from a meeting with Allison to a meeting with her husband, Chad. 6.
You're meeting with Chad at 6?
Well, solar array work group for the city.
You can miss that.
Well, he's the chair, right? So
He's the chair, but I'm a member. I'm representing Water Works Commission. All right, we are live, so we will go back. So I guess what I would look for is a motion to include language relative to us avoiding structural deficits and not using capital reserves as one of our budget priorities. Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. And just to be clear, that's priority 1
No,
on
we're not
this?
going to prioritize right
Well,
now.
But I mean, that's like
Right, right.
that would be similar to the language in the first one. I'm not talking about prioritizing all of these. I'm talking about the chart
We
up
would,
there.
we would, yes, we're just, so what I'd like to do is make sure we're capturing all of those priorities, and then we'll go back and prioritize. So let's get them into the mix. So I'd like to do that with separate motions, and then we'll prioritize. I don't have a motion, so is there a motion? Chair Gibbs.
I would make a motion that we not use capital reserves to pay for operating and/or debt service, and use potentially ARPA to pay for capital under the structural deficit heading, if you will.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lambert. Discussion. Not all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right. Why don't we just run down in order and then we'll prioritize. So the second one would be employee compensation. What are your wishes relative to that? I think administration had laid out a goal of 3%. Chair Gibbs.
Well, I'll make a motion that we build the budget based on a 3% increase in compensation to employees.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Health insurance. What are your wishes? What are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
I'll make a motion that we maintain the quality of health insurance that we are currently have for our employees.
Is there a second? Supervisor Lemmer seconds. Any discussion? Is inherent in there to evaluate the cost as part of that? I'm looking to Supervisor Marshall because this has been her issue.
Does that need to be an amendment to the motion?
I think we can have that as an understanding when we
I would like to make an amendment that includes looking at the delivery vehicle and the cost associated.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Leahy. Is there any discussion on the amendment? If not, all those in favor of adoption of the amendment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. And now the question is adoption of the motion as amended to maintain health insurance, but to evaluate delivery options and costs. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. New positions.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just based on what I understand, you kind of prioritized to this point, based on the matrix and the motions that were made, you've selected a number 1 for capital reserves, a priority number 3 for employee compensation, a arguably one or two for health insurance. I mean, you can't have 4 number 1s. So my read of this to this point is you'd be at a point where position expansion or contraction, if it's the highest priority it can be, is a 4, which is no new positions, which if you ask me, no new positions that aren't fully offset by, some offsetting revenue it strikes me as a logical position. And I would say our focus needs to be as an organization on filling the vacancies we have before we look too hard in the direction of what new services do we have. I don't know if that makes sense, Molly, from your perspective. I just wanted to make sure we are on the same page as kind of how the conversation, and I'm taking notes on what your prioritization has been based on the kind of blue diamonds in the middle.
Any discussion on that point? Or motions? Supervisor Hart.
I'll take a whack at making a motion to build the 2024 budget with no new positions created.
Unless they're fully,
Unless they're fully funded.
was that your, okay. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Marshall. Any discussion? Not all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That carries. Operating expenses?
No new
That-
ones.
Go ahead.
No new ones.
I think we've just we've sort of set what those operating expenses are.
I would say you're to the point where your motion is scrutinize necessities, needs, and wants.
Evaluate cost-effective delivery of programs while maintaining operating, expenses, something along those lines. I don't know what it would be. That would get into that whole issue of the facilities and driving down utility costs and other things. But is there any questions or motions?
Guess I'd make a motion that the operating expense, we look at every opportunity to include efficiencies in our operations.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Are there any additional priorities that you would like to see advanced to the board in the development of the budget? And again, we'll be dealing with assumptions at a later date. We'll be dealing with individual programs at the committee level and ultimately the county board level. Are there any other priorities? Yeah, Supervisor Hart.
It's not an addition, it's just saying that to simplify this, knowing that this has to go to the full board, I think this is a good basis to start with the priorities and bring that forward. Thank you.
All right, is there any ranking? Does anybody want to propose an order to these? Do you want to deal with them? It might make sense to put, if somebody has a motion that would be all inclusive, or we can do them one at a time if you wanted to deal with the top priority. What do you want to deal with the top priority first? We had two orders. We had discussion about whether they would be in the order that they are laid out in the resolution, or whether or not health insurance trumps employee compensation. So I guess those would be potential motions if somebody wanted to prioritize those. And ultimately, the county board will prioritize those. Chair Gibbs.
Well, I'd make a motion that we adopt the order that they currently are in based on the previous motions, all previous 5 motions.
Is there a second? Is there a second by Supervisor Hart? Is there any discussion?
Can I just clarify so at least staff know what that language is going to be? So I understand that to be switching numbers 2 and 3, but having the rest remain.
No, it's the order in the resolution.
The way they're shown on the resolution would be the way that I was making a motion that they state.
Okay, let me just pull up the document so I can,
So there would be structural deficit, employee compensation, health insurance, new positions, and operating expenses in that order.
so, and maybe clarification on the motion for employee compensation was 3%.
Right.
So under your decision-making matrix, that is here, right?
Yes.
So that's a 3. And in the
Oh, I see what you're
document here, it's listed 2. So, and your health insurance priority was to maintain it while evaluating quality and cost, which arguably is 1, but I can
Move it to 2 then.
move it to 2. And I think we're
We're good.
So I just want to make sure we're interpreting your motions, your previous motions accurately, that the order would be structural deficit still maintaining number 1 with the clarification to not use capital and instead utilize ARPA for capital purchases, as we discussed. Health insurance would be your second priority with a focus on maintaining the quality, examining the delivery vehicle, and evaluating cost. Employee compensation would be third then with a directive to build the budget with,
No, employee compensation is number 2. And health insurance is number 3.
I think that there's a different understanding. We're ranking them, but we're not assigning a number.
Do we need
So-
to assign a number based on the matrix, or can we just go with our motions as freestanding motions?
you are the governing body. I will simply tell you, having been a connoisseur of St. Croix County's processes and watching their meetings, what they do is they rank them ordinally, 1 through 5, with the broad direction then to the administration to kind of carry out the will in building the budget for consideration by the board.
I thought that's what our motions did.
I have direction. I mean,
Kurt?
Yeah, I think the one thing that, when we sit there and say that employee compensation is number 2, even though we're saying it's a 3% increase, but because employee compensation is such a large portion of our budget, I think that still has to take preference over health insurance, even though but arguably there might be a little more discretion over how we build health insurance, and I totally understand that. But I think from my standpoint, because it's such a large portion of our budget, I think I still would, and the structural deficit clearly is a large portion because we last year used, capital reserves to pay off debt. We used capital reserves to pay operating. Again, I think that makes sense to me to be number 1. So that would be the only argument that I would make over health insurance being number 2.
I'm interpreting our motions to sort of supersede the matrix points because that's the direction we're looking to give to the board. And I'm seeing Michael nodding and throwing up his hands and all at the same time. And so if that's all right, I think what we're looking for is what's the intent And while the matrix is helpful in the context of trying to frame the discussion, I think the discussion needs to drive the priorities, unless somebody objects. Cody?
I don't have any problem with that. One of the things I think we have to think about is explaining this to the full board, and the full board is going to look at this because this is what we've talked about. And then when we start saying, okay, so we've kind of done one of them, but we've modified it, and I don't have any problem. That just needs to be clearly stated to the full board. Otherwise, we're going to get to this resolution potentially tomorrow. We're going to have a lot of confused people because, like I said, this is what we've been talking about for this entire time, and we're kind of modifying this already. It just as long as that's clearly stated and kind of interpreted as we've made adjustments to the exact language in the matrix because of the circumstances that we talked about. So.
I think the way I would explain it is we use the matrix to guide the discussion to ultimately come up with the language and the priorities based upon that discussion. And the matrix was enlightening but not limiting. If that makes sense. I got a thumbs up. So the motion before us is to take them in order as they were presented in the initial resolution. Any discussion on that? If not, all those in favor of recommending those as a priorities will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right. Okay, we'll now go to tax increment financing evaluation. I didn't put task force in there given the concerns over task force, but we can certainly do that. Mike, did you have a chance to work on?
I have a rough ordinance / cover resolution for a task force in the event that's the direction you provide.
All right, so we'll start the discussion. We've been talking about this. I hope I have captured those things that we wanted evaluated in the list. It was my best stab at trying to capture everything we've talked about. Is this an inclusive list? Is that sort of where the direction that we're looking to go? A lot of it is background information, the status of them, and then what sort of policy recommendations might we have in certain categories. Anything you'd like to add or any questions? Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you encompassed a good starting point. I can see that as we investigate that other things could come up, but I think it's a great starting point.
All right, with that framework, we would then look at the next step would be to create a task force, and we've looked at creating a task force with county board, other local governments, business leaders, and citizens as sort of on that task force. A reporting relation by the end of the session of the county board Michael, why don't you go through what else you've...
Sure. So for the ordinance itself, the mission and purpose, well, the first is the reporting relationship we would need to identify. The second is the mission and purpose, which I think you've captured here and can be distilled into a few sentences. The membership, how you want to define those, the source of the members, citizen versus various committees, if you want to designate specific committees, terms of the members of the task force, duties and responsibilities, and then timeline and expectations. So those are the main blocks that are in our task force ordinances as they currently exist that I'd suggest we look at.
So we can proceed in the fact that we don't have an ordinance in front of us. Do we want to direct the Corporation Council to draft a ordinance incorporating these, this evaluation criteria and bring it back at a future meeting? Supervisor Hart?
I would ask what the alternatives to a task force would be, because we just went through a task force whole thing, and it was voted down by a supermajority of the board. And I just don't see us going into this effort any further if it's going to be voted down again. A lot of the arguments that were used against I'm referring to the Energy Task Force, wasn't about the Energy Task Force, it was about creating a task force in general. So I viewed that discussion, we don't want any more bureaucracy, we don't want, there was talk about the cost of having a task force and having people in this building and the security and everything like that. So there were all of these reasons that had nothing to do with the Energy Task Force that prevented the task force from moving forward, and I just want us to consider that that could happen again, and we could put a lot of work into creating something that is not going to pass this board again. So I'm just going to pose that, and we can talk about that further.
It's a fair concern, in so much as we need a 2/3 vote of the county board to create a task force. The options would be, one is to create a task force. The second would be to try to assemble that information and bring it to a standing committee or committees. In this case, the EEDC committee has some role or potential reporting relationship, and we could ask for a presentation. The third way would be to have somebody work on this and present it to the county board as an informational item. And there probably are other options, but those would be options. The latter two would not require approval of a task force, and sometimes you can get mired down in that approval process, so you're right. Any thoughts? Chair Gibbs.
The only, the challenge I think that you have, if you don't officially create a task force, there's been some community pushback, if you will, at least from one community, about the county board taking up a task force. It was reported in the Record Review that the Village of Marathon was opposed to the county trying to even look at this. If we don't have a process where we bring in community involvement and have community discussion and community leadership on that quote-unquote task force, or have some way of getting their valued input into the process, I don't think we're going to get results that we're looking for, and that is the direction that we're going to try to provide as to who's going to represent this county on the Joint Review Board, and what direction we're giving them in voting on potential extensions of time on TIDs, the creation of TIDs, and making donor TIDs. I think all of those are, if we look at the policy issues that have been laid out here, if we don't have buy-in from the community, we're going to have pushback from the community. And so I don't disagree with Supervisor Hart's characterization of creating a task force, but I liken this to be a much more, I think without a task force, you're not going to have the buy-in from the community. And I think then we're going to go through more effort if we're going to give it to a committee itself to try to develop. It's not going to be fruitful.
Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's a valid point, and I guess I was wondering if we could incorporate, it would be nice to have an outside perspective giving us, even if we go the route of educational presentations and standing committee presentations, it would be nice to have outside experts, community members, leaders in this industry topic, I guess, giving us that information, or at least starting that process, instead of it being completely internal.
And the best way to do that would be through the task force. So.
And I mean, to follow up, I guess, I too am concerned with the amount of time that we would be requesting of staff to put forth task force ordinances and language to then have the exact same discussion at the full board that we had, in prior months. It is a major concern, I think. It might behoove us to look more fruitfully at other options first than to put in that time.
Could I ask, for purposes of just giving us a guide, that we bring back a resolution at the next meeting creating the task force for your consideration? And in the interim, that we evaluate what the other options might be, and then we have a up or down, or we can go directionally at that time. But I think the advantage, I've heard from Rib Mountain and Marathon City with concerns over the direction we're going. I've heard some, from the city of Wausau. So I think that there are some people that are concerned we're trying to take away a tool, and I think we're concerned that we're trying to protect the taxpayers. So there's that balancing, and how do you bring the people to the table and do that? So if there's no objection, we'll direct Mike to incorporate that, and then Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know Wausau is currently, or maybe they did in April, looked at 3 TIFs. We've had zero information at the county level, and I find that problematic. So at the least, I would love to know what is going on, and Wausau is just one of the municipalities in our county. So it's not transparent, and I feel like we should be given the information.
Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I wanted to say was, as far as the work that will go into this, I have the cover resolution drafted. I have the ordinance drafted. I just need a little guidance on the membership, I guess, what direction you want to give me as to what the membership would look like. Otherwise, I'm just making something up.
So are we thinking you're probably looking at a couple county board members, a couple local elected officials? We would look for a representative of the business community and a citizen. So could we go 3 county board, 2 local, and two, or a business person and a citizen for discussion purposes? Go ahead, Gail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess if it's going to be a county board focused, we are looking at the impact to the taxpayer. I think it should have more county board members, not to say we don't want input from the communities, but to give equal amount to that, I don't think is going to serve us well. So I would suggest you have more county board members than other municipality.
Kurt?
Well, especially if we're looking at what the policy discussion and policy recommendations are going to be, and it clearly drives, what the county does, is at least at minimum on the joint review board, and giving direction to that person that's voting and who that person is going to be. I agree with Supervisor Marshall here in this case. I think we need to have it weighted in the fact that you need to have more representation on that task force, at least to the county board. Now, that's not to say that we don't value those community members, but I also am cognizant of the fact that if we're not going to get a task force, then I think it needs to go to a committee. But make no mistake, there's a lot of meetings that are scheduled in this outline that's to understand all of the information that's in that outline, and come up with recommendations.
Cody?
I think and I'm reading through this, the overall goal of whatever we would do would be make recommendations to TIF law, which is state legislature, because we don't have any control over TIF law. We don't have any ordinances that oversee that. So I think we need to we could end up in a situation where we have the county versus the municipalities, and then we're going to get to which one of them is the state legislature going to listen to. So I just, when creating a potential task force and thinking about who would be on that, if we diminish the municipality's participation, then the task force doesn't get to the root of coming together with municipalities to find some sort of solution.
So what are your wishes? I think Mike's looking for guidance, and we can put something in the resolution, and then you can amend it if it's not satisfactory or modify it. Supervisor Leahy.
I think it sounds fine as a starting point, and we're going to discuss it more at our next standing committee meeting. Just one other thing to note is when we come to the county board membership, to make that as inclusive as possible so we can avoid any misguided or not discussion about people being excluded. I think it needs to be open to anyone who's interested in the topic.
Nods everywhere. So do you have the direction that you need, or would you like a formal
I am comfortable with the direction if you're comfortable with the direction. I think I have my marching orders and I can rough something up for you for the next meeting.
Is everyone comfortable with his marching orders? According?
As long as those include alternatives to a task force as well.
I think that's up to us. He can't draft the alternatives. We need to come up with the alternatives.
I should say coming to the next meeting with that resolution for a task force plus other options directed by staff as to what we could do in this.
We will
topic.
agendize it in such a way that we can have that discussion.
Can I ask a very pointed question of the group in terms of membership, just to aid Mike in this? So we've talked a lot, the committee's talked a lot about ensuring that we have local government from municipalities, cities, villages. As you all know, under the Joint Review Board system under Chapter 66, another member of the Joint Review Board is a representative of the other taxing entities, so the technical college and the school districts. Would there be a desire to ensure we have, that this body would also have that perspective as well? If not, we can leave it out, but it strikes me that they might be in a similar situation in terms of impact felt as the county.
I see nods of concurrence, so we will try to, again, anything is draft, and we can look at it. So you've got your marching orders. We'll look forward to seeing it, but I think build it off of the evaluation criteria that we've laid out, and leave it including, which means that other things could be considered. Right?
Thank you.
All right, anything else? If not, thank you for your patience. Any items that you'd like to see us take up at a future meeting? If not, that next meeting is May 23rd at 3. And our item 9, who would like to make the motion? Moved by Supervisor Hart, seconded by Supervisor Marshall to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries. We are adjourned.